What if I told you that the most important piece of real estate on Earth isn't in the Middle East, it's not in the South China Sea, and it certainly isn't in any of the flashy financial capitals you see dominating headlines every single day? The most valuable piece of territory that could reshape global power dynamics for the next century is a frozen, sparsely populated island in the Arctic that most people couldn't even find on a map. I'm talking about Greenland, and what China is quietly doing there should terrify Washington more than anything happening in Taiwan right now. Because while American politicians have been obsessing over tariffs and trade wars, Beijing has been playing chess while everyone else plays checkers. And the move they're making in Greenland right now could checkmate American dominance in ways that seem almost impossible to stop. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't just another story about great power competition. This is a story about how empires rise and fall, about who controls the arteries of global commerce in the 21st century, and about a strategic blunder so massive that historians might look back at this moment as the turning point where American hegemony began its irreversible decline. So stay with me until the very end of this video, because what you're about to learn will completely change how you see global politics. And more importantly, it might just show you where the smart money is heading while everyone else remains distracted. Let's start with a simple question that reveals everything. Why would the richest country on Earth, a nation that has built gleaming cities, technological marvels, and the largest manufacturing base in human history, suddenly become obsessed with an icy wilderness where temperatures regularly plunge to -40 degrees and where more polar bears roam than people? The answer lies in what's underneath that ice, what's happening to that ice because of climate change, and what both of those factors mean for the future of global trade routes. China figured this out years ago. America is only now waking up to the reality, and the window to respond is closing faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. Greenland isn't just big. It's incomprehensibly massive. Spanning over 800,000 square miles, this autonomous Danish territory is larger than France, Germany, Spain, and Italy combined. If it were an independent nation, it would rank as the 12th largest country on Earth. Yet fewer than 60,000 people call it home, making it one of the most sparsely populated places in the world. For centuries, this isolation seemed like Greenland's defining characteristic, a frozen afterthought on the periphery of global affairs. But here's what changed everything. The ice is melting. And as it melts, it's revealing something beneath the surface that has made Greenland the most strategically valuable piece of real estate on the planet. Beneath Greenland's permafrost lies what geologists now estimate to be one of the largest untapped mineral reserves anywhere on Earth. We're talking about rare earth elements, the 17 metallic elements that are absolutely essential for everything from smartphones and electric vehicle batteries to advanced weapons systems and renewable energy infrastructure. Right now, China controls over 60% of global rare earth mining and processes nearly 90% of all rare earth elements used in manufacturing worldwide. This gives Beijing an almost unimaginable stranglehold on the technologies that will define the 21st century. Every F-35 fighter jet requires over 900 pounds of rare earth materials. Every electric vehicle needs them for motors and batteries. Every wind turbine, every satellite, every piece of advanced military hardware depends on minerals that China can restrict at any moment it chooses. Now imagine what happens when those same minerals are discovered in quantities that could rival or even exceed China's reserves, and they're located just a short distance from American shores. That's exactly what we're looking at in Greenland, and you better believe Beijing understood the implications long before anyone in Washington connected the dots. China's interest in Greenland didn't emerge overnight. It began quietly, strategically, in the way that characterized Beijing's approach to influence building across the developing world. Around 2016, Chinese state-owned enterprises began approaching Greenlandic officials with proposals that seemed almost too good to be true. They offered to build airports, upgrade harbors, construct mining infrastructure, and invest billions of dollars in an economy that had always struggled to diversify beyond fishing and Danish subsidies. For a population eager to pursue greater independence from Denmark, Chinese money represented something intoxicating: the possibility of economic self-sufficiency and, eventually, full sovereignty. The first major alarm bells rang when a Chinese company called General Nuclear Power Group partnered with an Australian mining firm to develop the Kvanefjeld mine in southern Greenland. This site contains one of the world's largest deposits of rare earth elements, along with significant uranium reserves. The combination was explosive, literally and figuratively. Rare earths for China's technology sector and uranium that could theoretically fuel nuclear ambitions created a perfect storm of strategic concerns. When news broke that a Chinese state-owned nuclear company might soon control a major uranium and rare earth operation just a few hundred miles from Canadian and American shores, politicians in Washington finally started paying attention. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, and this is something most people completely miss when they analyze China's Greenland strategy. The mineral wealth is only part of the equation. What China really understands, what makes their Arctic push so brilliant and so terrifying, is what's happening to the shipping routes above Greenland as the ice continues to melt. For 500 years, global trade has flowed through a handful of critical choke points that shaped the rise and fall of empires. The Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. These narrow passages determine how goods move between the world's major economies. Control one of these choke points, and you control the economic lifeline of entire continents. This is why the British Empire seized Singapore, why America built the Panama Canal, and why conflicts in the Middle East always carry global economic implications. These routes have been fixed in place for so long that most strategists treat them as permanent features of the geopolitical landscape. But they're not permanent. Climate change is rewriting the map of global commerce in ways that will reshape power dynamics more dramatically than any war or revolution in modern history. The Arctic, once an impenetrable barrier of ice that forced all trade between Asia and Europe to flow through those traditional choke points, is opening up. And Greenland sits at the absolute center of the new trade routes that are emerging. The Northern Sea Route, which runs along Russia's Arctic coast, has already become navigable for several months each year. Ships traveling from Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Arctic can cut their journey by nearly 2 weeks compared to the traditional route through the Suez Canal. That might not sound revolutionary until you understand that shipping companies operate on razor-thin margins and that even a few days saved translates into billions of dollars in fuel costs, labor expenses, and just-in-time delivery capabilities. But the Northern Sea Route passes through waters controlled by Russia, and Beijing doesn't want to be dependent on Moscow for its access to European markets. This is where Greenland becomes absolutely essential to Chinese grand strategy. The Northwest Passage, running through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, and the Transpolar Sea Route, which will eventually run directly across the North Pole itself, both pass within striking distance of Greenland. Whoever has influence, infrastructure, and operating bases on Greenland will have an incredible advantage in the Arctic shipping economy that's taking shape right now. China knows this. Russia knows this. America is starting to realize it, but the response has been dangerously slow. Think about what influence in Greenland would give China: year-round port facilities capable of servicing Arctic shipping, research stations providing detailed intelligence about ice conditions, weather patterns, and underwater geography, mining operations producing the rare earth elements that American technology and defense companies desperately need, and most critically, a permanent presence in territory that the United States has considered strategically vital for nearly a century. Because here's something that makes this entire situation even more complicated. America already has a major military installation in Greenland. Thule Air Base, located in northwest Greenland above the Arctic Circle, is one of the most strategically important military facilities on the planet. It serves as the northernmost base of the United States Space Force, home to the 12th Space Warning Squadron that provides missile warning and space surveillance capabilities. The radar systems at Thule can detect ballistic missiles launched from anywhere in Russia or China, providing the critical early warning time that underlies the entire American nuclear deterrence strategy. Imagine Chinese infrastructure, personnel, and intelligence capabilities established just a few hundred miles from this facility. Imagine Beijing having the ability to monitor American military operations in the Arctic, to potentially interfere with radar systems or satellite tracking, and to establish a presence that would make any future Arctic conflict infinitely more complicated for American forces. This isn't paranoid speculation. This is exactly what Pentagon planners have been warning about in classified briefings for years, and it explains why the American response to China's Greenland push has become increasingly urgent. When President Trump proposed purchasing Greenland in 2019, most of the media treated it as a joke or dismissed it as another unpredictable Trump moment. But strip away the unusual presentation and you find a strategic assessment that was fundamentally sound. Trump wasn't the first American president to consider buying Greenland. The Truman administration explored the same idea in 1946, offering Denmark $100 million for the territory. Strategic thinkers have always recognized Greenland's value. What changed was the urgency created by China's moves and the dawning realization that traditional assumptions about Arctic geopolitics were becoming obsolete. The Danish government's response to Trump's proposal was hostile. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the idea absurd, and the diplomatic fallout was significant. But something else happened that got far less attention. Denmark and Greenland started paying much closer attention to Chinese investment proposals, and several major projects that had been moving forward suddenly stalled. The airport projects that Chinese companies had bid on went to other investors. The Kvanefjeld mine faced new regulatory scrutiny that eventually led to the Greenlandic parliament banning uranium mining entirely, effectively blocking the Chinese-linked project. Was this coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the Trump episode, as clumsy as it appeared, served as a wake-up call that forced Denmark to confront the reality of what Chinese influence in Greenland would mean for their own security and their relationship with Washington. Sometimes, the most effective diplomacy doesn't look diplomatic at all, but here's what keeps Pentagon strategists up at night. China isn't giving up. Beijing plays a longer game than any democracy is capable of playing. They measure success in decades and centuries, not in four-year election cycles. The specific projects that got blocked matter far less than the relationships being cultivated, the technical knowledge being developed about Arctic operations, and the infrastructure for influence that's being built piece by piece, year after year. Chinese research vessels now regularly operate in the waters around Greenland, ostensibly conducting scientific research but almost certainly mapping the underwater terrain, testing communications capabilities, and gathering intelligence that would be invaluable in any future conflict. Chinese mining companies remain interested in Greenland's resources, waiting patiently for political conditions to shift or for new deposits to be discovered outside the uranium-rich areas that became politically toxic. Chinese diplomats cultivate relationships with Greenlandic politicians and business leaders, understanding that Denmark's hold on the territory depends on maintaining popular support among a population that increasingly dreams of independence. And this brings us to perhaps the most important factor in the entire equation, something that neither Washington nor Copenhagen wants to discuss openly. Greenland wants to be free. The Greenlandic independence movement is real, growing, and accelerating. Currently, Greenland receives an annual block grant from Denmark worth approximately $500 million, covering more than half of the government's budget. This financial dependence is the primary obstacle to independence. But what happens when a wealthy foreign power offers to replace that Danish subsidy with investment capital and infrastructure development? China has perfected this playbook across the developing world. Offer loans and investment that create economic relationships and political dependencies. Build infrastructure that creates jobs and visibility for local politicians who support engagement. Patient cultivation of relationships that pay dividends over years and decades. In countries from Sri Lanka to Zambia, from Pakistan to Montenegro, Beijing has demonstrated a willingness to invest heavily in exchange for strategic assets and political alignment. The same formula could easily be applied in Greenland, where the population is small, the resources are immense, and the desire for independence creates a natural opening for external powers to offer alternatives to Danish dependence. Now, you might be wondering why I said in the title that the United States can't say no to all of this. The answer reveals something fundamental about the constraints facing American power in the 21st century. America can't simply buy Greenland. The offer was rejected, and repeating it would only strain the alliance with Denmark that provides the legal basis for American military operations on the island. America can't force Denmark to reject Chinese investment, because doing so would be seen as imperial overreach and would play directly into narratives about American decline that Beijing is eager to promote. America can't compete dollar for dollar with Chinese investment, because Congress would never appropriate the funds needed to match what state-backed Chinese enterprises can offer, and because American companies operate on profit-seeking principles that make unprofitable Arctic investments difficult to justify to shareholders. Most critically, America can't say no to engagement because doing nothing would be even worse than the imperfect options available. Every year that passes without a comprehensive American Arctic strategy is a year where Chinese influence grows incrementally stronger. Every infrastructure project that moves forward without American involvement creates facts on the ground that become harder to reverse. Every relationship cultivated between Chinese officials and Greenlandic leaders represents a potential future advantage that Beijing can activate when the time is right. The bind that Washington finds itself in is almost perfectly designed to exploit American weaknesses. The American political system is optimized for immediate crises, not for slow-moving strategic challenges that unfold over decades. Congress can mobilize trillions of dollars in response to a pandemic or a financial crisis, but building the sustained institutional capacity to compete with China in the Arctic requires patience and consistency that American democracy has rarely demonstrated. The short-term nature of electoral politics means that any Greenland strategy developed by one administration might be abandoned or modified by the next, giving China an enormous advantage through simple consistency. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking. Each summer, more ice melts. Each year, Arctic shipping becomes more viable. Each month, the window for shaping the new geopolitical reality of the polar region narrows. The decisions made in the next decade will determine who controls the Arctic for the next century, and right now, China is winning by default, while America struggles to formulate a coherent response. So, what would an effective American strategy actually look like? First, it would require acknowledging that the competition for Greenland is real and that it matters for core national security interests. This might seem obvious, but the bureaucratic and political resistance to treating the Arctic as a strategic priority remains significant. Second, it would require offering Greenland something genuinely attractive. Not the heavy-handed approach of attempting purchase, but substantive investment in education, renewable energy, and sustainable development that helps Greenland build a viable economy without depending on either Danish subsidies or Chinese capital. Third, it would require working with rather than against the independence aspirations of Greenlandic people, understanding that a Greenland aligned with the United States by choice is far more valuable than one bound by Danish colonial legacy. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, it would require solving the rare earth supply chain problem that makes Chinese minerals so strategically important. If American technology and defense companies could source rare earth elements from Greenland, processed and refined in facilities owned by Western companies, the entire geopolitical equation changes. Suddenly, Chinese leverage over critical supply chains diminishes. Suddenly, the economic case for Greenland development becomes compelling to American investors. Suddenly, the partnership between Washington and Newark becomes mutually beneficial rather than patronizing. Some of this is starting to happen. The Pentagon has begun investing in rare earth mining projects outside China. The European Union is developing its own critical minerals strategy. Private companies are exploring Greenland deposits with increasing seriousness. But the scale of effort remains woefully inadequate compared to the strategic stakes involved, and the coordination between government and private sector that would be needed for true success remains elusive. What happens if America fails to rise to this challenge? The scenarios range from bad to catastrophic. At minimum, Chinese influence in the Arctic grows to a point where American power projection in the region becomes significantly more difficult and expensive. At worst, a future crisis in the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea finds China holding rare earth leverage over American defense manufacturers, while simultaneously operating surveillance and potentially military capabilities within range of the North American continent. The strategic implications of that scenario should keep anyone who cares about American security awake at night. And there's one more factor we haven't discussed, one that makes this entire situation even more urgent: Russia. The Kremlin has its own Arctic ambitions, and the relationship between Beijing and Moscow in the polar regions is complex and evolving. Right now, the two powers are cooperating on certain Arctic initiatives while competing on others. But a future where China establishes significant presence in Greenland while Russia dominates the northern sea route creates a polar pincer that would fundamentally reshape the global balance of power. American and European shipping would face potential interference on every route connecting Asia to Atlantic markets. Energy resources beneath the Arctic seabed would be divided between powers increasingly hostile to Western interests. The rules-based international order that has governed the Arctic since the Cold War would be replaced by something much more dangerous and unpredictable. This is why the Greenland question matters so much more than its occasional appearances in headlines would suggest. This isn't about Trump wanting to buy an island or about China investing in some mining projects. This is about who shapes the 21st century world order, about where the choke points of future commerce will be located, and about whether America can adapt quickly enough to a changing world to maintain its position, or whether it will be outmaneuvered by a rival that plays the long game better than any democracy can. The outcome isn't predetermined. America still has advantages in Arctic operations, in alliance structures, and in the trust that comes from not engaging in the predatory lending practices that have characterized Chinese investment elsewhere. But those advantages are wasting assets if they're not actually deployed, and right now they're not being deployed at anything close to the scale required. So pay attention when you see headlines about Greenland in the coming years. Pay attention when Chinese companies make new investment proposals. Pay attention when Greenlandic politicians talk about independence, or when Danish officials make statements about Arctic security. You're watching one of the most consequential geopolitical competitions of our time unfold in slow motion, and the outcome will shape the world that your children and grandchildren inherit. The ice is melting. The minerals are there for the taking. The shipping routes are opening. And Beijing is making its move, while Washington debates whether the problem is even real. The clock is ticking, And right now, America cannot afford to say no to engagement in Greenland because the alternative, ceding this critical territory to Chinese influence, would represent a strategic failure of historic proportions. The question is whether American leaders will recognize this reality in time to do something about it, or whether we'll look back on this moment as the point where the outcome became inevitable. What do you think? Can America compete effectively in the Arctic, or is Chinese patience simply unbeatable in a long-term strategic competition? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this video helped you understand what's really happening in the world while most people remain distracted, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're going to keep bringing you the analysis that matters. The next video goes even deeper into how China's Arctic strategy connects to everything else Beijing is doing to reshape global power. You won't want to miss it.